Welcome to Haggie Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggie, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, this is Colleen, and this is Haggie Reads for You. And today I thought I would read a PDF that was mentioned in our chat room during Yvonne Palermo's show, Groovy Beans, with her host, Dustin Deschamps. And it's called The Children of the Law of One and the Lost Teachings of Atlantis, by John Peniel, dated 1997. A presentation of the Children of the Law of One. The foreword. Reality? This book chronicles the author's personal experiences and presents ancient spiritual teachings and philosophy. In order to make it as interesting and readable as possible, much of it is presented in a story and dialogue style, based upon the author's experiences. Conversations with monks, teachers, and students were reconstructed from records and the author's memories. Thus, while not perfect transcripts, the dialogue does accurately reflect actual conversations. Hopefully, the book will be more than just interesting. For those with an open mind and heart, it will also give reason to ponder the nature of life, the universe, your beliefs, and the potentials that exist within our own personal life. This book isn't about Atlantis or proving its existence. Besides the fact that many things about the nature of the universe, creation, God, and ancient history are impossible or nearly impossible to prove at this time in human development, the sole purpose of this book is to convey something far more important, ancient spiritual teachings that can change your life and indirectly improve the world. We believe that it's best for everyone to attain direct personal experience of God and discover the true nature of the universe and creation for themselves, rather than taking anyone's word for it, or believing what they're told or read, including this book and our teachings. Thus, even though we do necessarily discuss some unprovable ancient history, concepts, the teachers provide the means for achieving the direct experience and the direct knowing yourself. By reading the conversations and thoughts of the author as he is learning this himself, you too can discover a return path to the universal spirit or God and inner peace. We aren't trying to convince anyone of anything or asking anyone to accept anything in this book on faith. We're simply presenting ideas. We leave it up to you to think about the principles and the teachings presented, and decide for yourself whether or not they are a good thing for you, for others, and for the world. Within all of us is a lie detector, a silent inner voice that offers us the greatest potential to discern truth and reality. People have fooled experts with so-called physical proof, but the inner voice is never fooled. The inner voice could also sometimes be termed as a gut feeling, intuition, or women's intuition. But it can also be much more than that. You may not be very in touch with all of this at the time, but you can be if you want to. The inner voice is a part of God within you that knows what is true and what isn't. If you will just hear it, It doesn't talk. It is just a knowingness. The only reasons behind people not hearing their inner voice are fear, desire, and selfishness. If you can transcend those things even for a moment, you will have the most reliable source of discernment that exists. Even when all external appearances of truth say one thing, and your inner voice says another, you can bet that your inner voice is right. Note: earlier editions of this book referred to an elder monk named Ra. This was not the person connected with the channeled Ra material. Our order, the Children of the Law of One, the author, and this book are not in any way connected to or related to the Ra material, which is now also being called the Law of One material, or a person using the name Ra who says he is the Law of One teacher. We don't wish to imply anything bad about this person or the material, but we needed to clarify the situation because some people have thought that we were associated. Humor, seriously. Humor is a very esoteric thing, in a way, and most people don't really understand it. Ancient teachings refer to it as the great neutralizer. Most never stop to think why human beings laugh. For one thing, they need to laugh. In our lives, laughing can neutralize or minimize the devastating effects of pain and suffering, both our own and that of others. If you stop and think about the next time you see a comedy show, you'll find that most comedy is based on other people's misfortunes, from minor mishaps, embarrassments, and humiliations, to major screw-ups in life, and sometimes even physical energies, like someone falling down a flight of stairs or off a roof. All human beings, whether they are sinners or saints, need to laugh to maintain their sanity and health. Laughing could even heal. Thus, truly spiritual people, as opposed to those who put on an air of seriousness in order to give the appearance of being spiritual, have a great sense of humor. They certainly take their work very seriously, but they don't take themselves too seriously. Also, because of their work, they need to laugh and be humorous even more than most of us, because they're dealing with more pain and suffering than most of us. The author of this book is no exception, and the book reflects this. Unfortunately, most seekers are very serious. It's only natural. The ancient teachings presented here are very serious also, and that doesn't mean you can't have a little fun. And if you don't take yourself too seriously, you'll be able to enjoy humor where you may find it, and perhaps lighten your own load just a bit. Rules of writing. The author knew an English professor who taught English and vocabulary at a university in California. The professor once told him that he taught his students to feel free to invent new words, if there wasn't something already just right for what they wanted to communicate. That's how language expands and gives people the ability to more accurately convey their message to others. Subtleties of meaning also often require new words to communicate them properly. The author believes the same concept applies to the use of grammar and spelling. Rules of any kind shouldn't hamper the style or content of any communication, and if they do, we must make up new rules. While writing has certain grammatical rules that are meant to govern it, it is also an art, and if the impact or message can be enhanced by breaking these rules, they should be broken. Using fine art as an example, Van Gogh was criticized and rejected because he didn't follow the proper rules of styles of painting. Yet most people now recognize that he conveyed feelings and sometimes a message that could have only been done by ignoring the rules and expressing himself freely. The author of this book has approached his writing in a similar manner. He has deliberately ignored convention in favor of communicating with the reader in a way he feels most effective. Much of this is because he wanted the writing to reflect speaking to you. This creates a more intimate communication, and also more accurately represents the thoughtful deliberateness of speech that is characteristic of many teachers. Thus, in this book, you will find odd words, phrases, sentences, odd grammar and punctuation, and odd usage of all the above. It's not because the author is illiterate or due to lack of professional editing. Some of the differences include, but are not limited to, extra commas. For instance, they have been deliberately inserted to reflect an enhanced pause. Hyphenated or strangely spelled words to make something stand out, get you to think, or make a connection to another thought. And chronology that doesn't follow a linear timeline in order to properly present the teachings. These aren't extreme differences, and the author believes it actually helps some readers transcend the limitations of left-brain thinking just a bit, and makes the book even easier and more enjoyable to read. Introduction. Survivors of Atlantis. Stories of Atlantis. Why do they exist and where do they come from? Why are they so persistent? And why is the subject of Atlantis so fascinating to so many people? Many scholars now cite archaeological evidence of ancient civilizations that were destroyed by a great catastrophe, which they believe could be the source of the stories. But that raises even more intriguing questions. If Atlantis was once a great civilization, who were the Atlantean people, and what were they like? Within the recorded history of many cultures, there are references to the great island of Atlantis and its highly sophisticated civilization. Some people dismiss this as myth. Many of these cultures had not known contact or knowledge of each other's civilizations, so why would such diverse ancient peoples, such as the Maya, the Egyptians, the Hopis, or the Greeks, have the same legends? Plato, a highly respected Greek philosopher and teacher, gives a detailed non-fiction account of Atlantis. Due to that and other factors, many scientists no longer argue about the existence of Atlantis, just the whereabouts. Even marine scientist and explorer Jacques Cousteau searched for underwater archaeological evidence of Atlantis. It ended with his son believing Atlantis was probably in the Caribbean or the Atlantic, and Jacques believing it was in the Mediterranean. Even though they both found what they believed to be evidence of an ancient sunken civilization, neither had definite proof that they'd discovered the remains of Atlantis. However, little absolute archaeological proof is likely to even remain from any civilization destroyed by a cataclysmic disaster, let alone tens of thousands of years ago, let alone one sunken beneath the sea in a totally unknown area. Even the great Titanic was only recently found, and only after extensive searches, even though scientists knew approximately where it sank. Furthermore, it went down only decades ago, and it sunk from merely hitting an iceberg, whereas Atlantis allegedly sunk long, long ago in an unknown location and was totally devastated by unimaginable natural catastrophe, a distance so great that it may have had a ripple effect around the world, which brings us to the legends of the Great Flood. Cultures the world over, who don't have a specific legend of Atlantis, still have stories of a great flood that destroyed most life, which happen to be very similar to the story of the sinking and flooding of Atlantis. Descriptions of the destruction of Atlantis say it involved great earthquakes and volcanic upheavals, and the actual sinking of the entire landmass. So perhaps some legends of a great flood could have come from secondary flooding that resulted from unimaginably gigantic tsunami waves generated by an event that was the greatest geological disaster in history, like the one most scientists say caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. Such waves could have swept the globe, flooding many, if not most, parts of the world, and eruptions could have darkened the sky and created other disastrous ecological consequences. The various culture stories of the Great Flood often tell a tale of refugees who managed to escape the great disaster. Some legends, like those of the Hopi tribe, describe the Hopis as such refugees. They depict the Hopi escaping the calamity and coming to their new land of giant flying tortoise shells. It is said that once they arrived, they were led to safety from an environment gone mad by a bird-headed Kachina, who guided them to underground passages. To the open mind who researches this subject, the evidence that Atlantis did indeed exist is overwhelming. But if Atlantis, as Plato described, was a highly advanced, sophisticated civilization with technology that even surpassed that which we have now, shouldn't there be some other remnant of their society? Not necessarily, but just perhaps. According to the legends, Atlantis was so thoroughly destroyed by natural catastrophe that there was nothing left. Yet couldn't there have been some Atlanteans with enough foresight to leave beforehand and escape the disaster? Or some that were traveling in other parts of the world at the time? It seems quite possible that, given the stories of how advanced and sophisticated a civilization it was, that at least some traders or travelers were elsewhere in the world at the time. Some theories say the mythological inhabitants of Mount Olympus, the gods of Greek and Roman mythology, were actually Atlanteans that survived. Now just consider this amazing possibility. What if groups of Atlanteans not only survived, but established communities in various places? What if they continued to pass on their heritage, their history, philosophy, and religion, even to this day? Some people could teach us so much and fill us in on the great missing piece of human history. That is where this book comes from. It was written by a priest whose order traces their lineage from Atlantis to Egypt in the days of the construction of the Sphinx and Great Pyramid. Oddly enough, this book isn't about Atlantis. It covers some little-known ancient history, but only as necessary background. Instead, the book focuses on the philosophy and spiritual practices that originated there. Atlantis is just ancient history now, but the teachings of their spiritual traditions are all still invaluable in the present. Most importantly, though, the author brings an urgent message, and rather than a New Age philosophy about life, he presents Old Age ways to live by that can really change your life and world. Fortunately, it's all presented in a fascinating format in which the reader gets to discover everything themselves through the eyes and experiences of a young North American. We get to be with him during his 3 years at a monastery, share his personal trials, and see his changes. We also get to experience some of his amazing encounters after returning to the real world as an enlightened teacher and head of the order. Besides presenting the author's experiences and simple teachings about how to find your own enlightenment, the book has another message for the world. He points out similarities between the present state of affairs in the world and the last days of Atlantis. What if we have come full circle in a historical cycle? You may have heard the saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The author tells us that our future depends on the choices we make, and on what we have learned from our past. If that is true, the story of Atlantis may well be the most important history lesson of all time. But other than filling in a possibly vital part of human history, the book gives us something perhaps even more important. It presents us with a beautiful spiritual philosophy that guides us toward a better life through personal growth. The wisdom and teachings it imparts are wonderful, fascinating, and also very useful when applied to our everyday lives. Chapter 1. The Children of the Law of One. The Children of the Law of One and the Edgar Cayce readings. The author of this book and I are both priests, monks of an obscure spiritual order called the Children of the Law of One. The famous unique psychic Edgar Cayce referred to our order in a number of his many psychic readings. Some of the information we present in this book apparently confirms information in those readings. While this attests to Cayce's remarkable abilities, we are not experts on his readings, and thus cannot guarantee that everything here will be in agreement with them and vice versa. But from what we do know of them, and what we've heard from people who are very familiar with Cayce, this book substantiates his readings, enhances understanding of them, and offers new ways to apply the spiritual principles spoken of in them. Apparently, the teachings in his book may be at the fulfillment of his prophecy that a John Peniel would bring to the world a message about the new spiritual order of things around 1998, the year this book was first published. Before this book was published, we were unaware of that prophecy. We attempted to publish anonymously, but were told certain distributors and chain stores wouldn't carry the book unless we put the author's name on it, and so we relented. Shortly afterwards, we began hearing from members of an association founded by Cayce, the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, telling us about the prophecy. Many said after reading the book they were sure this was the fulfillment of it. We make no claims regarding this issue one way or the other. However, the R magazine, Venture Inward, published what many consider an intentionally negative review of the book, focusing on irrelevant stories and ending details rather than the teachings or addressing the above issues. What's in a name? The name of our order is unfamiliar and odd to most people. One reason is that we have deliberately avoided public notoriety, generally preferring to live and work in peace, undisturbed behind the scenes. The Dark Ages are still with us, despite what history books say. Sometimes, specific members become famous, but only when necessary for their work, or unavoidable. Another reason the name sounds odd is because of its obscure and foreign origin. The name of the order was originally expressed as one concept, and can only really be understood as a whole, but breaking it down may help you understand it better. Just try to keep this paradox in mind. The name means many things, but only one thing. The first part, the children of, relates to us all being children, in the sense of subordinates of God, which we call the universal spirit, obedient to God in universal law. The end part, one, essentially means God, rather than a giant silver-haired man in the sky. We consider God to be the totality of everything that exists, the universe itself even. Thus God is the One. The middle part of the name, the law of, comes from the fact that within the One there are universal laws that govern the operation and function of everything in the universe, applying to all things, all vibration, physical or spiritual. Put this all back together again. The children of the law of One then essentially means those who obey universal law and serve the universal spirit. Thus, something that is very important in our opinion is being in harmony with, one with, and a servant of God. The primary key to that is loving unselfishly. The rule of loving others unselfishly is sometimes called the Golden Rule. Many individuals and religions believe in the same concept. It was even the only commandment given by Jesus. And the way he said people would identify his followers, i.e., true Christians, would be recognized by loving others as Jesus did. Unfortunately, the Golden Rule is seldom lived by or focused on. It's often overlooked and not given the major significance it deserves. This book will go into more detail about that later. Throughout history, we and branches of our order were sometimes known to various cultures by other names also, but generally unknown to the masses, working behind the scenes. We provide inspiration and education that nourishes the best in humankind, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. It may take the form of the arts, the sciences, spiritual or political philosophy, etc., but in all cases, we bring some form of light into a world of darkness. Thus, some of our initiates have been known as scientists, artists, spiritual leaders, unusual political representatives, and freedom fighters. Anywhere and any way we can promote spirituality through unselfish love and a return to oneness, we do. Sometimes the name of our order, or one of its branches, is stolen and used by others with a dark agenda. Sometimes even the teachings are taken and twisted to serve their purposes. In their supreme selfishness, the greedy have used our names and corrupted our teachings in the pursuit of money, pleasure, power, and even world domination. I'm sure many of you can see how Jesus' name has been abused to mislead people. This also happened with the name the Great White Brotherhood. Now there are also those abusing the name Children of the Law of One. You will know the true children of the Law of One by our emphasis on unselfish love and freedom, rather than on spiritual knowledge, secret information, power, or phenomenon. Let the universal spirit, our inner voice, be your guide, lest you fall into the beautiful traps of darkness. Who we are and what we do. Initiates of our order have been dedicated spiritual caretakers of humanity since human life began. We have always been vigorous proponents of truth, freedom, justice, and compassion. Our teachings and ways have always been carefully preserved and passed down directly from teacher to student, who then becomes a teacher, etc. This is continued as an unbroken chain, using all means, including reincarnation. You may or may not believe in reincarnation, but does it really matter that much if we care about each other, are good to each other, and follow the golden rule in our lives? It doesn't matter to me whether you believe in reincarnation or not, and I hope it also doesn't matter to you whether I do or not. You may have heard how one famous Buddhist spiritual teacher in our times, the Dalai Lama, continues to reincarnate, repeatedly taking the same position in life, serving as a teacher and leader of the people of Tibet and of Tibetan Buddhism. This one enlightened being has now been reincarnated over a dozen times as the Dalai Lama. This practice is not exclusive to Buddhism. Enlightened teachers of the children of the Law of One also continue to reincarnate, although they usually choose different bodies and positions in life for various reasons. Some of our order have been called ascended masters, saints who have passed on. But many actually continue to reincarnate in physical bodies to directly aid the people of the world. While many people believe that ascended masters or saints are the highest or greatest beings, those who choose to come back to earth rather than ascend pay the greatest price. Their continued reincarnation is a painful sacrifice that they make for all of us, including you. These loving beings make this sacrifice so that those who wake up crying in the dark and desperately reaching out for God will have a someone to take their hand and help guide their way. In order to serve those who need our help, there have always been approximately 1,000 initiate monks on the earth at any given time. But as you will later read, at the time of this writing, there are but a few hundred. Some live monastically, while others live amongst the people of the world. Most go about their work quietly, often unnoticed. Even though we usually strive for anonymity, many gained historical recognition. They have been known as saints, sages, founders of religion, scientists, inventors, teachers, artists, writers, musicians, philosophers, magi, and even as some of the founding fathers of the United States. But whatever their undertaking or apparent profession, they have a common earmark. They always promote and exemplify unselfish love, oneness, and freedom, and are at odds with the instigators of selfishness, hate, separation, oppression, and slavery. Leadership within the children of the Law of One is based on and determined by an individual's consciousness or level of spiritual development. Thus, the most humble and most self-sacrificing are the highest ranking and powerful leaders of the children of the Law of One. These beings have always had the most positive influence on the world throughout history. The being who was known in one of his lifetimes as Jesus is an excellent example of this. Known also by other names throughout history, he was our Grand Master, the foremost leader of the children of the Law of One throughout the ages. His example of strength throughout self-discipline, caring, and unselfish love spread a message throughout the world. A message he knew would only get told throughout the world if he made the ultimate self-sacrifice. Unfortunately, after his spiritual ascension, greedy men began to misrepresent his words and deeds, used his name and edited parts of his teachings in order to gain wealth, acquire power, and even to justify harm. Like the Grand Master, all but one of these old ones The earliest ancient leaders of the children of the Law of One have passed beyond the physical plane and chosen to no longer be incarnate with us here on earth. As the current period of this cycle of earth draws to a close, he is making the ancient teachings available to the public for the first time, to provide a candle in the window of guidance and hope. John Peniel, the present head of our order, will begin his story in the next chapter. It includes the story of his physical journey through life, but for the most part, it portrays his spiritual journey. He tells his story in such a way that the reader can follow and share his thoughts, feelings, and experiences as he begins the studying and training that transforms him from a novice student monk to an initiated monk or priest. The first half of this book reveals the ancient teachings in a format of his personal relearning and changing during his days at the monastery. And in the second half, he presents our personal meditation and energy exercises. Chapter 2, My Journey and Arrival. This book is an account of my personal journey of discovery, and more importantly, what it led me to and can lead you to also. If you find some of the teachings or stories hard to believe, I understand perfectly. Some of my experiences were so incredible that even though I was personally experiencing them at the time, they were still almost hard for me to accept. But I had no choice but to ultimately accept them, whereas you do. However, those who really want the truth and are ready for it will recognize it. An intuition that's unfettered by ego and selfishness will always sense truth and reality. In any case, the point and purpose of this book is not about my story, the alternative history, or the strange tales presented here. Frankly, they just don't matter. So read it all with a believe-it-or-not approach, keeping in mind that it's absolutely fine with us if you don't believe any of the story or theory-like aspects of the book. Regardless of whether or not the story is too incredible for your own sensibilities, this book is really about identifying the real disease behind our personal and world problems and the cure for it all: unselfish love. That's what we sincerely hope you get out of this book and find useful on your own incredible personal journey through life. Other than that, we are not interested in convincing anyone of anything. Every individual needs to have his or her own realizations. Foundations of Understanding. In school, people are often required to take prerequisite classes before they can take certain other classes. That's because sometimes you need to understand certain fundamental concepts first, before another class will really make as much sense as possible, or allow you to get the most out of it. The teachings presented in this book are similar. Some of them require prerequisites to understand. Thus it was necessary to present the teachings in a specific understanding order. But because of this, the chronological order or time frame of my personal experiences at the monastery had to take a back seat to the order in which the teachings are presented. For instance, in some earlier chapters, a discussion may be taking place when I was an older monk, while in later chapters a discussion that is taking place may have been one of my first days at the monastery as a novice monk, and a rather egotistical novice. Some stories will even be after my time and training at the monastery was over and I was traveling the world. Many chapters include more than one discussion or experience that I had for more than one time frame. If you pay close attention to the subtleties of conversations, you will understand basically what time frame it is taking place in. taking the same mental approach to reading the book that you would with a chronology jumbled mystery novel should make it more interesting and fun to read rather than confusing. My first steps, a strange child in a strange land. My final voyage began decades ago, when I was 17 years old. But what led up to that began years prior. Like the Dalai Lama, I was destined to return to my previous position with our spiritual order. Unlike the Dalai Lama, I was not told of it in my early childhood, nor was I aware of it. While I didn't have the kind of direct contact with elder monks like the Dalai Lama did, I had special caretakers on high. Unbeknownst to me, events outside my control were preparing me and compelling me to embark on a great adventure that would change my life beyond my wildest dreams. To simplify it, I guess you could say angels and saints were secretly guiding my young life. This book covers the period of my life at the monastery in more detail than what I offer about my childhood. Well, that's because that monastic period is the most important, as it is used to present the teachings. I only touch upon my childhood briefly in order to give you a sense of what I was like and what I experienced prior to returning to the monastery and rejoining my brothers and sisters. Some readers had commented about how they relate to my childhood experiences and have had similar experiences themselves. Thus, it helps understand the entire process of spiritual change. I was a very strange and sensitive child, considered oversensitive, with unusual abilities. But when I was very young, I had no concept of being that way, what that meant, or why I was that way. It was just the norm for me. I had no idea that the reason for it was my latent consciousness and my predestinate to return to the same state of being as when I left my previous life. Even so, many of the things I experienced were not just due to that. Many of you gentle and kind souls have experienced the same things as I during your childhood. Abnormally bright, I was reading the newspaper at age 3, and self-learning to play music by 5. I couldn't relate to adults, and other children for that matter, nor could I fathom why they were so mean, self-centered, and selfish. And their idea of fun, many of the things they did, seemed either meaningless to me or worse, cruel. So my childhood was very painful and lonely. Sound familiar? As I approached my teenage years, I was further alienated when I was let down by my religion. It was a major religion, which I will refrain from naming, but I would eventually have had the same crisis of faith with many other religions. As with most people, I was raised by my family to believe in their religion, and thus to believe in their concept of God. Just as when I was very young, and time experiences pierced my illusion about the existence of Santa Claus, the same thing began happening with my belief in the existence of God. The dogma and behavior of the leaders and practitioners of my religion was shooting down my faith. Certain person experiences and holes in the teachings and practices ultimately let me down and left me feeling empty and even more alone. At first, only doubt about my faith set in, but finally I was left with total disbelief. It was a horrible, dark time. The worst part was I didn't just lose faith in my religion. I lost faith in the existence of God. And by the time I was 13, I'd become an atheist. But it turned out that I had only lost faith in the concept of God that I'd been taught. I didn't yet know it, but it was really the beginning of developing my own understanding of God, trying to connect pieces of an ancient puzzle. Looking out at the stars and observing the wonders of nature and life, I felt there must be something. There was order, constant new creation, symmetry and beauty to all of it. Even if it were not what I had previously thought God was, there must be something to it or behind it that one might be considered as God. Or maybe it was all God. So before I was 14, I became an agnostic, one who doesn't believe in God, but doesn't necessarily disbelieve in God either. Caught in a paradox, I knew there must be some force behind everything, but at the same time I couldn't find any right religion that really made total sense. And the total vision theories of creation offered by most evolutionary scientists also left far too many unanswered questions and were full of holes. Nothing truly answered the questions about life that constantly tormented me, nor eased my loneliness. It's not that I had a bad family life. It was better than most. Yet I still felt like an abandoned baby, left in a basket on the doorstep of a strange world. I had to find some kind of answers that made sense to me. I became obsessed. My thirst was insatiable. I had to find answers, truthful answers that made sense about the origins and purpose of life. I read every book I could get my hands on about science, religion, philosophy, spirituality, and metaphysics. I tried different religions, including various Eastern philosophies. But at some point, I was always ultimately disappointed with what I could find. I found bits and pieces of truth here and bits and pieces of truth there, but something was always wrong with the entirety of the religion and philosophy. Either something was missing in the teachings, or some aspect of the teachings didn't make sense, or the religion made the teachings more important than the purpose behind them, or it was too dogmatic. Yet I could not stop searching. I was always seeking to find a source for pure, consistent truth and real answers to every one of my questions. At 10, I had been tested with a very high IQ. Yet at 16, I had flunked out of high school for various reasons, and around the same time I had a terrible argument with my mother over religion and relationships. She didn't like my girlfriend and my rejection of the family religion, so I moved out of my parents' house, started college, got a job in my own apartment. All of a sudden, I was thrust into having to face the facts of living in the real world. I didn't like what I saw and experienced. It was a dog-eat-dog world, and as far as I could see, there were only two kinds of dogs, those who were eaten by other dogs, and the dogs who did the eating. For all practical purposes, those were the only two basic ways of dealing with making a living and living your life. In other words, I realized that the world was basically populated by two kinds of people, the users and the used. The powerful and successful people of the world got that way and stayed that way by stepping on other people, whoever they needed to step on in order to get ahead. Thus, the majority of people were usually always getting stepped on, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. We had a whole world based on this, and the results were starvation, suffering, and servitude for most, while a few elite individuals had tremendous power and lived in incredible opulence and luxury. I also knew there was no good political solutions to these problems either, including such things as communism or socialism, because the problems were in basic human nature, and corruption always seemed to get a big foothold, regardless of the political system. Even then, I realized the answer to this problem could only come from a change that took place inside every person on earth, and I knew the chances for that were absurd. As I matured, it became even more clear and more unbearable. Eventually, my pain over this became overwhelming. I no longer wanted to live in the dog-eat-dog world. I couldn't tolerate the idea of living life as one of the eaters or one of the eaten. I gradually became entertaining thoughts of suicide. New hope arises from an odd place. One day, someone recommended I read Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land. Obviously, I could relate to the title alone. But there was far more to it. I couldn't put it down. Even though it was fiction, it stirred something deep inside me that was very real indeed. Something that haunted me from then on. An idea was planted in my mind that I couldn't stop thinking about. It was no more than a mere concept, yet it was more. It presented a wonderful and great ideal. It was the simple concept of human beings living together in a community, in harmony, as one big family who shared everything and unselfishly loved and cared for each other and all others. What a great idea, I thought to myself. That's it. That's the answer. That's what I was looking for. To me, what was represented in that science fiction book seemed more like real spirituality, and how truly spiritual people would live, than most of the so-called spiritual or religious books I'd read. I was sad that it was fiction, and the people weren't real. But I didn't see why there couldn't really be people that lived like that somewhere. It seemed like if something could even be conceived of, it could also be real, or eventually become real. So fiction or not, it gave me hope, and spurred me on to continue my spiritual search even harder. But after a while, it appeared that my search was futile. I simply wasn't able to find a religion, spiritual path, community, cult, or even one person that fit my ideal. My frustration over this eventually turned into deep despair. I grew increasingly despondent, and by 17, I finally gave up on finding anything or anyone who really had all the pieces of this grand puzzle, or people who fully lived a life of truth, peace, harmony, and love. And with my hope lost, there was nothing left for me here, and I decided to end my life. But right before I was about to do it, I had a very odd experience. One that not only resulted in my not killing myself, but in finding a new way of thinking and of living. I was about to realize that there was a third way of living in this dog-eat-dog world, not just the two choices of being a dog-eater or dog meat. The strange experience I was about to have would forever change things in me, in ways I couldn't even imagine at the time. Well, I think I'm going to take a little break here, put on some music, and I'll be back in just a few minutes. Alrighty, I am back. It must be the age of TV. What happened next was very bizarre. You might say it was a significant example of Jung's concept of synchronicity. But it was even more than that. For those who aren't familiar with the concept, synchronicity is like coincidence, but it is not just chance. It's actually meaningfully connected to other events, possibly even connected to the entirety of all things in the universe, God. But you could also call it universal flow, or a modern miracle. A simple example of this would be talking with someone about a certain topic, and then a song comes on the radio that fits the conversation perfectly, and perhaps has a significant message regarding it. Just before I was about to take an overdose of sleeping pills to do myself in, I started old-fashioned channel surfing, turning the knob on my old black and white TV. I know it might sound strange to do that when you're in the process of killing yourself, and I didn't even know why I was doing it at the time. I thought maybe it was out of habit, maybe out of desperation, maybe for entertainment, distraction, or comfort in my last minutes of life. But as it turned out, my channel surfing wasn't for any of those reasons. It was an urge I was following, for some kind of divine guidance or protection that was compelling me to do it from within myself. Anyway, to my surprise, as I turned the channel-changing knob, I noticed a picture on the U channel setting, and that was very strange indeed. There was never a station broadcasting on that channel before. In fact, at the time, there was no UHF stations at all. To make a long technical story short, for those of you too young to remember TVs back then, there was a broadcast on a channel that virtually couldn't have had a broadcast on it in those years. There was never anything but static on those channels previously, and it'd be years into the future before any television shows would ever be broadcast on them. The odds against the entire complicated incident were beyond any odds. It could have only been some kind of higher force, a television test, or some television genius kids messing around with the airwaves. The later possibilities quickly faded as I viewed the show. On my TV screen was a man who looked much like the stereotype image of God. It was sort of an interview, but a little more like a lecture. As fate would have it, definitely, the subject matter of the lecture was all about spirituality. God, the universe, creation, and a history that went way beyond any I'd ever known. His energy and intensity was striking. His eyes seemed to look right through me, yet right at me, like he was actually speaking to me in person. It was as if Zeus, Merlin, and Moses had merged into one being and stepped out of history into my living room. He was dressed in a white robe, and from my studies I recognized that he was wearing the type of ancient headdress worn by the Essenes, and purportedly worn by a legendary ancient spiritual tradition called the Great White Brotherhood that I'd read about in books from the 1920s, not to be confused with the modern groups that call themselves that. He spoke perfect English, but with a subtle hint of an accent that was unidentifiable, and he pronounced certain ways using British-style pronunciation rather than American. As I listened to him speak, the man's every word struck a chord in me. They rang my inner bell of truth. Here was someone who obviously knew many of the scattered little bits of truth I'd found, but they were all consolidated into one teaching. As I listened in awe, his strained TV lecture answered my many unspoken questions. It was almost as if he was reading my mind. Even when he spoke of knowledge or concepts I'd never heard before, I seemed to already know them somehow. Author's note. This book could have a similar effect on you, depending on who you are and at what stage of your path that you're on. But next he spoke of his origins. No, it wasn't outer space or the heavens. While it was not nearly so far-fetched as that, it was still amazing. He said he was a monk of an ancient spiritual order whose name in English was the Children of the Law of One. But they were known by many names throughout the centuries. That name rang a bell, both internally and because I'd read something about it in the Edgar Cayce material. As I listened, I was caught between feelings of total awe and wondering if this was really happening, like maybe I was on candid camera or the butt of some practical joke. The man went on to say that their spiritual lineage, their teachings and practices, stretched back to ancient Egypt, and before that, Atlantis. He said their order was not devoted to any one religion, dogma, or worshipping any leaders, past or present, but rather it was dedicated to serving and experiencing God directly, via the development and use of unselfish love. They were also dedicated to helping others achieve that, if they wanted to and were ready for the task. But while true total freedom has never been a condition of life on earth, they taught how to develop real freedom of thought and considered free will choices to be a sacred right. But most importantly to me, they were devoted to living a life of giving, caring, kindness, sharing, compassion, and harmlessness. It was what I'd been looking for my whole life. His descriptions of their life evoked images that seemed like memories. It was like experiencing déjà vu. Before even getting to the place or situation you have the déjà vu experience at. I felt as if I'd been there before. I was so excited I literally almost passed out. I had discovered that there was actually people out there who were living by all the same values and ideas I'd come to believe were true. And here, I'd just totally given up on the possibility that other people who believed and felt as I did even existed in real life. Could it be I'd finally found what I was searching for my whole life, just as I was permanently giving it up? As my mind raced with the excitement and questions, the man gave directions and instructions for getting to one of their monasteries, in Tibet no less. Then the screen went back to static, and there was never another show on that channel. I later found out this was not a broadcast for the public, which will be explained in another chapter. I didn't understand how this could happen, but nevertheless, it changed the direction of my life. I intuitively, at least knew this much. It wasn't a joke, a hoax, or an hallucination, and my course was set. While I was still only 17 years old, I was determined to change my life, no matter what it took or where I had to go. In fact, I was compelled to do so as a moth is drawn to a light. Author's note. Many of my experiences, such as these above, and those you will soon read, are very unusual. This is because even though I didn't know it at the time, I was a high-ranking teacher, priest, or initiate monk of our monastic order. It was who and what I was in my previous life. It just hadn't come to fruition in this life yet. I was unaware of it at the time because I was in a sort of embryonic stage. Now I was being called home to fulfill my destiny. This is similar to how Tibetan Buddhists seek out the new reincarnations of their head monks, yet obviously different in this case. Since the first printing of this book, people have contacted us wanting to enter one of our monasteries, but our monasteries have always been private, designated for those already of the order who have reincarnated. Although a few newcomers are accepted by head monks, the occasions are rare, and new monks are only accepted after long periods of demonstrating readiness. However, people wanting spiritual growth and fellowship also have another alternative to the traditional monastery. They can now start or join various local Golden Rule programs with the help of the new Golden Rule organization, GRO. These programs provide some of the benefits of a monastery without the need for moving, changing jobs, or having a teacher. Information on GROW and the Golden Rule workbook are at the end of the book. A few people have been irrationally obsessed with details about Atlantis, my journey, my personal life, or the locations of our monasteries. Most people are understandably curious, but not obsessed. However, because of the nature and purpose of this book, there's really no reason to elaborate on those topics, while there are reasons not to. The sole purpose of this book is to present detailed spiritual teachings and demonstrate making personal spiritual changes, using my experiences as an example. While we tried to make it very interesting, this isn't a novel or storybook, and it's a waste of effort, time, and money to fill it with stories that don't teach a spiritual lesson of some kind. It is also not the book's purpose to be a biography of my or my family's personal private life, nor to present evidence of ancient historical or archaeological discoveries. There are many interesting books that focus on ancient history, lost civilizations, free power systems, etc., like the David Childress books. But this isn't really the book for you if that's what you're primarily interested in. This book was written only for those who are primarily interested in spiritual truths and spiritual growths, not for those interested in irrelevant details and empty, useless knowledge. Thus, the only parts of my story it contains are those that others might spiritually benefit from reading about. Also, please keep in mind that this book isn't about the story. It's about the teachings. So it also doesn't matter to us if you don't believe any of the story that you're about to read. But you can only benefit from all that life offers you if you keep an open mind. But you can only benefit from all that life offers you if you keep an open mind and judge everything independently. We believe that everyone should question the validity of all teachings or beliefs, but only in light of whether the effects of them are good or bad. The wise examine the value of any teaching or philosophy independently, judging it by the outcome of living by it. Everything in life should be contemplated and examined regarding its benefits, lack of benefits, or potential harm. An alcoholic may tell you it's bad to drink. A fool may speak a wisdom. A liar may be speaking the truth. A 3-year-old child may speak the most precious wisdom ever known to humankind for the first time in history. Should they be disregarded? So, please consider the teachings separately from the story. Read them with an open mind, then ask yourself, do they stand the test of rationality? Of goodness? What would happen if I lived by these teachings? What would happen if everyone in the world lived by them? What does my intuition tell me? After that, then you should judge. Privacy, and please do not disturb sign. As mentioned earlier, this book is not about the monastery either. The monastery is but a place, and with the context of this book, it is used as a backdrop for the story and discussions that present the spiritual teachings. Those of our order wish to remain undisturbed and anonymous, as I do. Our order is not alone in this book. Regardless of religion, those who decide to become a cloistered nun or monk do so to devote themselves to a spiritual life, and choose the monastic path because they want solitude and to be in an isolated environment away from the outside world, so they can live and practice their religion unmolested and without distraction. That is part of what every monastery, convent is for, and provides. Thus, no monastery would want the kind of attention a book like this would bring to it, even more so in our case. As mentioned earlier in this book, we have legitimate reasons for maintaining the secrecy we have cherished for thousands of years. But later on, you will read about some new reasons that further substantiate that need. Also, those of us who travel and work in the outside world also need our privacy and anonymity in order to do our work and live in relative peace. In summary, since our order wishes to live quietly, in solitude, undisturbed and unmolested, this book has been deliberately written to avoid any references that might jeopardize our solitude and privacy, including the location of monasteries. The fool takes his first steps. As wild as this may sound to some people, there really are forces of what you call light and darkness, or good and evil, that work behind the scenes of this limited physical world we live in. I didn't understand it at the time, other than having an intellectual grasp of the concept, which was far from being in touch with the realities of what that meant. Unbeknownst to me, they knew my every move. While I was being guided and somewhat protected by the forces of light, the other side was trying to throw me off track or destroy me. The outcome would ultimately depend on the choices I would make. My first test and struggle was to be with the major resistance I encountered from my family and friends. They didn't like the whole idea. They didn't want me to leave, and they didn't like the idea of me joining others of like mind. Generally, people would rather keep you with them in the hole that they're in, rather than let you get out and offer a helping hand to help them out of the hole. So those of us who want to get out of the hole ourselves often not only don't get support, we get just the opposite. We get people, and sometimes events, doing everything they can to prevent it and keep us in the hole. Even though I hadn't lived at home since I was 16, my mother initially attempted to keep me from going by using her parental authority, refusing to let me go and threatening me with the police or putting me in an institution because I was underage. Then, when she realized that wouldn't work, she pulled one of the oldest mother tricks in the books, the famous "I'm sick, you can't leave me now" routine. Most people are capable of making themselves sick, psychosomatically or accidentally, but she went beyond that. She'd been studying hypnosis, the power of the mind and such, for as long as I could remember. So she made herself sick. And while it was nothing serious at all, it was a somewhat painful temporary illness, an outbreak of sores, that was more painful if she didn't stay in bed. So she was using that along with saying I was being selfish for leaving as a guilt trip in an attempt to manipulate my life and free will choices. But she had already kicked me out of the house a year prior because of her jealousy towards my girlfriend. So I wasn't living with her anyway, and there were dozens of other relatives looking after her. But even if it were more serious, I would have still had to leave. I found out why later. I was internally compelled to go, regardless of any obstacles, let alone ones that she was deliberately creating to manipulate me and keep me there. My internal drive and feelings were so strong, I felt like I would die if I didn't change my life, which was probably true. There was truly no choice. For those of you who might feel sorry for my mother, ask yourself if she was serving the light or just herself, and subsequently the dark. Then there were my so-called friends, who turned out to be fair-weather friends, as most turn out to be one day when the chips are down. Most of them never liked my spiritual pursuits, and my new goal was the worst as far as they were concerned. All but one tried to talk me out of it. They told me I was crazy to go, crazy to give up everything, and like my mother, they tried to make me feel guilty about abandoning them. They didn't want to get out of the hole that they were in, and I did. And they wanted me to stay in mine. I didn't know it at the time, but my old friends, without knowing it, were also being unconscious pawns of the dark side. But considering my momentum and strong desire, they could not avert me from my goal either. The urge to go felt almost biological, like a salmon needing to swim upstream to return to its spawning ground. My friend John was the only person I knew who didn't try to talk me out of going. While he wasn't really supportive, he wasn't resistant either. He said, "You gotta do what you gotta do." We actually had a lot in common at the time. He and I were always able to have spiritual conversations and agreed on many things, unless they threatened his life choices. As we said our goodbyes and talked about life, he felt more and more like joining me. All of a sudden, he decided to go for it. But when he called his girlfriend and told her about his decisions, she gave him some news that stopped him dead in the tracks. She said she was pregnant, and it wasn't the usual accidental story. She admitted she had deliberately stopped using birth control, which John had assumed she was still using, because she loved him so much and wanted to have his baby. Whether it was true at the time or not, she deliberately got pregnant in a scheme to entrap him. She knew he was the kind of guy who would do the honorable thing and marry her, and he did. But what is the honorable thing when you've been deliberately entrapped so dishonorably? It's one thing to take responsibility for an unexpected but legitimate event, but quite another to play victim to such a treacherous scheme. A family that starts with that kind of severe and serious deception can only end badly, which it did. The dark side at work again, only against him this time. I advised him against it, but he insisted on doing the right thing anyway. I saw John again many years later. He and his wife had an ugly divorce after having 2 children. He was miserable and had become an alcoholic with numerous DUIs. John had irrevocably missed a significant fork in his life that I now know would have changed his life and those of others for the good. For me, it was back to the road alone and with a new sadness. Author's note: everyone who starts on a true spiritual path encounters multiple obstacles and attempts to derail them. It just happens in different ways for each individual. Keep this in mind if you're taking your first steps. It can happen in so many ways. A great new job offer, an old lover you'd never gotten over finally calls to say that they want to get back together. Your car breaks down. You name it, it can happen. People may also twist things. You may be told that you're being selfish by making your spiritual pursuits a priority, when the fact is, you're actually starting a path toward becoming unselfish for the first time in your life. Anything that can possibly deter you from what you really want to do and the goals that you've set up for yourself may come up. Home at last. To make a very long story very short, I headed to Tibet, using any means that would get me there, from hitchhiking to freighters to camels, a story in and of itself. When I got to the outskirts of Tibet, guides associated with our order snuck me across the border and led me to the monastery. Communist China had already invaded, and troops had to be avoided at all costs. The monastery was in an isolated area of the Himalayas that was considered forbidden even to Tibetans. Other than those of our order, no human had ever stepped foot there, until recently, when some daring and hardy explorers finally discovered the area. As we got closer to our destination, I was shocked to find that we were entering a warmer, wetter area. Most of the Himalayas are stark, frigid, and barren. And here I was, in the midst of these great frozen giants, surrounded by thriving, warm region plant life. And how beautiful it was. Finally, the day arrived when my quest would come to an end. All of a sudden there it was, the place my heart and soul had dreamed of. It was beautiful and strikingly unique. The pyramids, domes, and cubic structures created such a unique artistic and otherworldly symmetry. I'd never seen anything like it. Seeing it from a distance, I was stunned, thrilled, scared, awe-inspired. Hundreds of feelings rushed through me like the waters of the powerful falls nearby. As I approached the monastery, I noticed many small buildings all around the outside of its walls. I found it interesting that people inhabiting them and working around them were not at all dressed in Tibetan fashion, but rather they wore the garb of various cultures. Most noticeably, they were all very warm and friendly, welcoming me with their smiles. Immediately upon reaching the entrance to the monastery, I was greeted by a bright, friendly female monk. I discovered she was to be my liaison, and initially a kind of orientation tour guide. "Come in," she said. "My name is something unintelligible to me." She saw the perplexed look in my eyes and grinned. That means Eastern Star in English. I must have looked how I felt, which was, that's one heck of a handle to call somebody by. She looked at my eyes kindly and said, "Just call me Anastasia. That's my old name. My parents were from Russia." I was in such a state of awe and finally finding what I had hoped for all my life that I was speechless. So while I thought to answer her, I remained silent. "As you know, we have been expecting you," she said. "I'll show you around, and initially answer any questions you might have." Questions, I thought to myself. I have more questions than I can probably even ask in my lifetime. She took me by the hand and began to show me the grounds. "Thank you," I finally managed to find part of my tongue. Like she said, they were expecting me, and it was obvious from the guides and others who met me along the way that they also knew the timing and path of my journey. I didn't understand exactly how they knew it all, but I figured I'd find out later. For now, though, I was more interested in the reactions I was getting, or not getting, from the other monks on the grounds. Some were obviously working, doing some yoga-like techniques, and others appeared to be just sitting and hanging out. Many of them stopped and stared, while others seemed to be ignoring me. It just seemed sort of odd to me at the time, so I asked her about it, and about the people who were living just outside the monastery. You'll find out later about the people who lived near the monastery, but to answer your question about the monks here in the monastery, it's just the timing of your arrival. Author's note. I later found out there was more to it than that. We are all very busy, and those you see here, pointing to the group who seem to be ignoring me, are doing special long meditation exercises that require deep concentration, and they would have to start all over again if they stopped, or even lost their concentration. She smiled and said, although I noticed some of them lost their concentration anyway. Then I caused more of a stir than I thought, I said. Oh, you'd be surprised. You'll get a chance to meet everyone later, but why don't I just show you the grounds for now? Sure, on with the tour. But I gotta tell you, I've come farther to get here than Disneyland, so I hope it's worth it. Disneyland? She spoke perfect English with an American accent, so I'd assumed she was familiar with Disneyland. Well, I'll tell you about it later. You probably won't believe me anyway. Oh, yes, I will, she said with a cute, innocent enthusiasm. I can tell I could have some big fun pulling her leg. Anastasia, you speak English perfectly. Those of us who were raised here are multilingual, but even the monks who weren't raised here learn at least English or Spanish in addition to their native language, if it is something other than that. Monks have come here from all over the world. Some are also fluent in many of the various languages spoken in most part of the world, even ancient languages. You can learn any language here that you wish. I'm having a hard time enough with English at the moment. How many languages do you speak? Only 7 modern languages. Oh, only 7? That's too bad, I said jokingly. She didn't get my sarcasm and just nodded in agreement. As Anastasia was taking me to her first stop on the tour, I began asking many questions about the architecture. Be patient. You can't learn everything in one day anyway. You will find out everything you want to know later. When? I don't know. Tomorrow, next year, a decade. Whenever you do, you will have. Her unrevealing, complex, perplexing answer reminded me a bit of the short time I'd spent earlier at a Zen monastery. Those Zen monks certainly love their paradoxical questions and answers. I didn't know it at the time, but I would discover far more paradoxes here, and eventually come to understand them. Finally, the radiant young woman showed me to a room where the monk was speaking to a group of other monks. There are many adepts who can help you grow here. Of course, I know everyone can teach you something. Even life itself is a teacher. She pointed at the man who was speaking to the others. He is my special personal true teacher, and has also been like a father to me, especially since my parents are no longer with us on this plane. He helps me change and grow. How does he help you change? He helps me see and understand myself clearly, and thus I can change things about myself, and I wouldn't ordinarily even see him. How does he do that? And what does true teacher mean? You love asking more than one question at a time, don't you? There's just so much I want to learn. I understand. I was just teasing you. I should probably answer your second question first. The adept, or initiate monks like him, are also what we call true teachers. That's because they've transcended their own selfishness and self-centeredness and achieved what we call universal consciousness. Many different spiritual traditions have their own name for achieving that. Some call it achieving Satori or Nirvana, some illumination, and some, like us, refer to it as enlightenment or initiation. But whatever you call it, it is a transformation that creates a total change in their viewpoint and way of life. That brings us to your first question. Because of their broad universal consciousness perspective, their unselfish love, and lack of selfishness, they thus see everything, including people, very objectively, purely, and clearly. So they see things about yourself that you don't see yourself, or even things you block or hide inside yourself, and bring them up to you. Thus you can use them as a sort of tool to see yourself clearly, see things you want to change, and then change if you want to. Only the adept monks are what you call true teachers, then? Yes. There are basically 3 kinds of monks in our order. Novices and elders are still essentially students. The adept or initiate monks are more like personal growth facilitators or therapists. Why do you use the term true teacher instead of just master or teacher or guru or something like that? Because it's accurate. It also avoids labels that are sometimes associated with ego or lack of humility, and at the same time separates them from just an ordinary teacher. Many people and things can teach you, but a true teacher is a specific type of teacher. They're true in the sense of accuracy or lack of distortion, like a true arrow. It's that sense. It's just like a true mirror is best for seeing your body or face rather than an untrue mirror with imperfections that would distort your face or your reflection. Like I said, their teaching or telling you about yourself is pure and true because of the objectivity they are achieved from not being contaminated by or subject to their own selfishness anymore. So rather than thinking about themselves all the time, as most people do, they aren't self-centered or defensive. Because of their unselfish consciousness, they don't have anything to personally gain or lose in dealing with you, or to get in the way of their objectivity about you. So they just think and care about you, your best interests, and the best interest of all others. And they can tell you what they see from that great higher or broader, more loving perspective, if you ask for their help or opinion. The room where this true teacher monk was giving a talk was lit only by candlelight, so I couldn't see his face very well. But when everyone went outside to do an energy exercise, I saw it clearly. It was the man I saw on TV. I didn't know it at the time, but he would soon be the most important person in my life. While some part of me rejoiced, some part of me cringed. I don't know why at the time. I just knew he was somehow frightening to me, like staring death in the face. Later, I would realize it was because of his ability to confront me and show me myself, which my selfish, self-centered ego strongly wanted to avoid. Because of that, I would do everything I could to avoid him for a while. But there was an even stronger draw I had toward something about this man that would eventually lead me to ask him to be my special mentor also, my personal teacher. I didn't know his name yet, but soon I heard one of the other monks there call him Zayin. My head was reeling. I had to remind myself that this wasn't a dream. It was another world, one that I thought only existed in my imagination just one long year ago. Outside in a courtyard, Zayn and over 100 people formed a circle, holding hands, with arms outstretched between them. They were about to do an energy technique called the star exercise. I had read about this years ago in a very old book I read by an author whose last name was Ledbetter, or Leadbeater, or something similar. The book was about what he called the Great White Brotherhood in Tibet, and it described them doing something called the star exercise during a festival called Wesak. But many of the particulars were never mentioned in the book, and the author's stories also indicated that the people were as inaccessible as any myth. So while the book fascinated and attracted me in many ways, and his description of the people sounded like home, it left me with nothing I could further pursue. Now I found myself living it, the real thing. Anastasia ushered me into position in this giant human chain that formed the circle and gave me quick instructions. And then it began. I closed my eyes as a feeling of lightheadedness came over me. My head and body were buzzing with energy. I thought I was perhaps starting to black out, yet all I saw was fluctuating white light. It seemed as if I was experiencing 1,000,000 thoughts and pictures, all in a moment's time. As I opened my eyes, I saw energy vibrating in all things and all the people there. Everything was flashing with white light, superimposed over it. Apparently, I wasn't the only one experiencing some dramatic effects from this star exercise. A novice monk had come to join the exercise a little late and stood alone outside the circle. He collapsed and lay there as if lifeless. I heard Zayn muttering some kind of astonishment about it being dangerous to stand outside the circle. Then he said loudly, "One has left the body. He has become lost. I must retrieve him." And in a few moments the body of the collapsed novice twitched, and he returned to consciousness. Afterwards, Zayn sat in the side courtyard garden for a sort of question-answer session. I was still vibrating with energy and seeing it everywhere. I wanted to tell him about my experience, but was simultaneously afraid to say anything to him or bring attention to myself. But I did, and that is a story we'll save for a later chapter in the book. Anastasia then started walking me over to the monastery's residential area. I didn't know what to expect. I'd studied other monasteries, and had even visited and spent some time in some. In monasteries that teach or utilize constant asceticism as a primary spiritual growth tool, the monks' quarters are often called monks' cells, because that's pretty much what they were, tiny jail-like cells, like what you might find in a prison. Of course, to the monks who chose this kind of path, their cells were a voluntary part of their training, not a means of imprisonment and punishment by a government. But in any case, I didn't even like the idea of dormitories, let alone cells. I would later learn to drop such personal preferences in favor of adapting and flowing, but I wasn't there yet. On our way over, I asked Anastasia about the living situation with nervous, introverted concern. "So what do you have here, monk cells or dormitories?" Except for temporary aspects of a monk's training, learning self-discipline and special transition training, which I was about to come face-to-face with, our way of life is quite moderate and even luxurious by many standards, especially by other monastic standards, at least as a general rule. "That's nice to hear, but you didn't exactly answer my question. I especially don't like dormitories." "Well, they are and they aren't. You'll see. When we finally arrived at the monks' residential area, I was quite relieved by what I saw, although it was naturally odd, like most everything else around here. "These are the private sleeping, living, and meditation areas," she said. I expressed my relief to Anastasia. I have to admit this is far nicer than what I was expecting, yet it is rather bizarre. I was surprised to find an odd honeycomb of private rooms, and where the quarters Anastasia was showing me were far smaller than the monks' quarters of many other orders. Oddly enough, they were very cozy and comfortable. In fact, there was no comparison to the dark, dank, cold harshness of the traditional monk cell. They were beautifully decorated, had curtains, pillows and mats, sheets and quilts, little combinations, shelf altar storage areas, incense burners, candles, even lights. But they were tiny. "They're pretty tiny rooms, Anastasia." "That's true, but they're tall enough to sit up in, read and meditate in, and long and wide enough to lay down in. They serve as both our personal quarters and places for our solitary meditations." "Even for someone my size?" "Sure. And actually they are quite comfortable and cozy. In fact, we call them wombs instead of rooms because they're so cozy. They're kinda like a womb. Cute." The wombs were an ingenious architectural design and concept. They were much like honeycombs. Their efficient design would allow many of them to fit into what would be a normal-sized bedroom for someone in the U.S. But more importantly, they were modularly designed, so if you had a mate or family, wombs could instantly be connected and expanded as needed. And as it turned out, they were extremely cozy and comfortable, and I never found them lacking as either living quarters or meditation chambers. But I was in for another surprise. "So which one of them is mine?" I asked. "Novices don't get one right away." I later found out that was just to put novices through some tests and changes that created personal growth. "Then where do I sleep?" I said with a bit of surprise and stress. "See that pile of mats over there? When you're through for the day, just go get one and find any place you can and lay it down." My stress just jumped up a notch, but I immediately got a grip on myself. What the heck? After what I'd lived through, even that would be a luxury. What I didn't know at the time is there was a deliberate shortage of mats, and it was first come, first serve. I made that surprise discovery that night, but I couldn't find any more mats. Okay, now I was an unhappy camper. But in time, I learned it was all part of the series of tests and growth techniques that everyone like myself went through on this path, and the rewards were far greater than the sacrifices. Note: I eventually got a 5-unit womb with a view. After the wombs, she brought me to the library. I was astonished. It was vast, the largest building I had yet seen. "This is our library." "Where do I get a card?" I asked. She looked at me quizzically. "I don't think we have any cards, but we have many, many other things to read." She wasn't kidding. And she also wasn't kidding about many other things to read. Texts, scrolls, tablets of every description were in there. The important literature, philosophy and religious teachings from cultures all over the world were at my fingertips, including various ancient and modern translations in most languages. There were even texts about cultures that had no written language. I felt I could spend the rest of my life just in here. No, I could spend lifetimes. Where did they all come from? It was collected over time. We also have original texts from most religious teachings, including the biblical, in their original handwriting. I was in heaven. She had to drag me out of there to continue the tour. Anastasia eventually took me to a relatively small meditation room compared to the hall that I'd seen earlier. This is where elder monks teach classes for novice monks. Elder monks were ones who had learned and grown a great deal, but still had not achieved total unselfishness or total enlightenment. But even so, they had a lot to offer, and were far nicer people than I had ever met. They were as good as saints from my perspective and consciousness at the time. What kind of courses do they give? Elders teach courses in meditation techniques, basic spiritual principles and their application, history, and conduct some limited personal growth sessions. I wouldn't be spending most of my time learning and getting counseling from elder monks during my first months at the monastery. The entrance to this meditation room had a very short door, and I had to bend over in order to get in. "Why is the door so short?" I asked. It obviously had been custom built, and the room itself was as big as a large living room. By building the door so it physically requires those who enter the room to bow, it is meant to symbolically remind both elders and novices to be humble and have respect and compassion for all. A class was about to begin, so she advised me to stay there and begin my first course. "Am I a monk now?" I asked. "That's up to you. This is a monastery, and only monks stay here. I assumed that's why you came. I hope I didn't overstep my bounds with my assumption." "No, I do wish to stay, learn, and grow. I guess I'm just accustomed to people not being so sensitive and having to sign up for everything, even getting your car lubed." "Well, I don't know about you getting lubed, but you will need to ask the head monk if you can stay. However, we've already discussed you, and he also assumed you would be asking to stay, considering—" She briefly paused mid-sentence as if she almost slipped up and told me something she wasn't supposed to, but she immediately spoke on, "and has already indicated your acceptance." "So what kind of monk am I then? A student, novice, elder, frater, brother, or what?" I joked. "Novice. You need a teacher to be a student, and you need to be a student to be a teacher." I wasn't quite sure what she meant by that. She was going zen on me again. "Will I see you later?" I said. "Well, of course, dear. We live together now." I didn't know exactly what she meant by that either, but I figured it wasn't the same thing it meant in the outside world. "When will I see you again? And please don't say maybe tomorrow, maybe a year." She touched my shoulder lovingly and said, "I'll be by as soon as the class is over, okay?" "Okay." There were about a half-dozen other English-speaking novices there in the room, new and relatively new students of various stages, and I got my first taste of what would be many courses. Even though these courses were not given by the teachers who were enlightened masters, I was totally impressed by the wisdom, kindness, and compassion of the elder monks who conducted them. I learned all kinds of things in various courses, including ancient teachings, the religions of the world, meditation and energy techniques, yoga, etc. But sometimes the elders just spoke spontaneously about things other than what the course was about, and when they did that, I was floored by what I thought were their psychic abilities. It was as if they were reading my mind, picking up on my energy thought, answering my many unasked questions, and finding my hidden secrets, and then discussing them all out in the open to free me from my inner burdens. It was kind of like getting indirect therapy. It seemed like every word was just for me, but I couldn't understand how this could happen, just for me, when there were other novices in the room at the same time. I wondered if they were having the same experiences. I later found out that it was not a psychic thing that was happening, at least as we know it. It's not simple to explain. It's covered in later chapters, though. But the elders who were giving these courses were doing a meditation technique to sort of get out of their own way, so to speak, in order to really be in touch with us and to be conduits for what we needed to hear. They didn't really even consciously know themselves what they were thinking, or what they were saying, or why, but the effect was the same. By the time the session was over, I was so exhausted I was about to drop. Anastasia met me as I come out the door, but I was too tired, even for her, so I bid her good night. But instead of reciprocating, she was silent. When she finally left, though, instead of saying good night, she said, "Get a good rest." Later I found out that the reason she didn't say good night wasn't because get a good rest was the local customary phrase, but because good night was just a subconscious habit phrase of mine, that thus had become only a meaningless parroted phrase, rather than a meaningful statement, or statement of caring. In other words, saying good night probably originally came about from wishing someone to have a good night and actually consciously meaning what they were saying. Now, however, it had just degenerated into the preconditioned, subconsciously programmed appropriate phrase to say when someone went to bed. The same went for many common phrases like good morning, goodbye, God bless you, and many more. So in order to learn all about my conscious and subconsciousness, I needed to stop and think about these things, and take opportunities like not saying a simple good night to help break the patterns and increase my awareness. I had a lot to learn about the mind still. I looked for a mat and couldn't find one. I was way too tired to panic or even ask anyone about it, so I found the nearest corner that was out of the way and just hit the floor. I was immediately out like a light. The next morning I was awakened by Anastasia with a cheery smile and a cup of tea. I was still wiped out and groggily sat up. It seemed like I'd just closed my eyes and laid down. "Drink this," she said. "What is it?" "It's tea, silly. It'll make you feel better." I sipped some. It was terrible. "What kind of tea is this?" "It's called mate. It's from Brazil and difficult to get, so don't turn your nose up at it so quickly. Tastes like old socks. It grows on you. Soaking things on old socks, but that doesn't mean I want to drink them," she laughed. "You'll appreciate it soon. It's the only drink we have right now that has caffeine in it, and it also seems to help adjust the attitude." "You allow caffeine here?" One of her eyebrows raised in surprise. "This isn't a rigid order. In fact, moderation in all things is the cornerstone of the order." "Ah, caffeine. It tastes a little better now that I know that. I'm just exhausted, and I didn't sleep very well. I couldn't find a mat." "Oh, you poor thing," she said truly sympathetically. I didn't want to appear whiny or a wimp, so I responded with proper machismo. "It's not the lack of the mat that was the problem." "I understand," she said, patting me on the knee. "I still remember a trip I took with my parents from here to India when I was a little girl. You're going to need a few days to recover at least. That's why I let you sleep so long and brought you some tea." "Sleep so long? It looks like the sun just came up." "Yes, that's what I mean. We usually rise before the sun." "Is that one of the rules here?" "Most of us do, but not all." "Are there any basic rules here?" "Yes. Be kind. Don't hurt anyone." "That's it? Surely there must be more." "Well, yes, of course. You have a lot to learn." "So what are the other rules?" "Well, you're supposed to get me tea every morning," she joked. "Seriously?" "No. Only if you want to. I don't mind. I'd be happy to." I was just teasing. I already get tea for myself and someone else every morning. But thanks for the offer. You'll eventually get into the swing of things and get a schedule. Unless we have something to do otherwise, we get up with the rising energies of the earth before the sun, do a few private morning meditation techniques and yoga, then have a morning meeting and group meditation. One of the adept monks speaks afterwards. All monks have some kind of work to do around the monastery, and you'll have various meditations to learn and master that you'll be practicing at different times during the day. You'll probably spend some time every day reading the ancient teachings in the library, but your routine might be different, I don't know. It mainly depends on what your personal teacher thinks you need. Everyone is different, so they all need different things in order to learn and change. So your routine may be very different from mine. I hope not, she smiled again. So what is my routine right now? I don't know. What do you mean? I thought you were going to get me in the groove of things here. Only to an extent. The rest, like I said, will be up to your personal teacher. Okay, so who's my teacher? I don't know. You don't know? She nodded affirmatively. This was getting a little ridiculous. It was starting to remind me of trying to get a straight answer out of a Zen master I had back home. So I tried to come at it from a different angle. But before I could, she spoke again. Only you can decide your own personal teacher and who it'll be, and ask them to be your teacher if you want to. Well, will you be? She laughed and said, I'm hardly qualified to be your teacher, but thank you anyway, I'm honored. That was real sweet of you to ask. I already told you who my personal teacher is, and I can tell you what my basic schedule is. Would that help? She smiled. Anything would be welcome, Anastasia. Are you a nun, Elder? A nun? Well, we are all the same here, so whatever male or female you could call us, monks or all nuns or all whatever, they're just words. Titles and ranks for a position don't matter. It doesn't really matter what you call anyone. It's what you are that counts, don't you think? Sometimes the labels help keep some things more organized in our silly little brains, but sometimes it can create false or unfair divisions and false worship where none is warranted. I guess I might be called a nun in certain orders, except I'm not fully celibate, which sometimes being a nun requires. So generally, we all consider ourselves just monks or students or teachers, depending on our capabilities and consciousness. Well, I think I'm going to have to stop there for now. I hope you're enjoying this book called Children of the Law of One, The Lost Teachings of Atlantis. And I'll see you next week when I'll pick up where I left off. Thanks for listening. Bye now. See you later.